afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean here at the Institute, and I am delighted to welcome you to Radcliffe, an institution powered by the same commitment to ideas and discovery that Hub Week celebrates. Hub Week, a civic collaboration between the Boston Globe, MIT, Mass General Hospital, and Harvard, showcases innovation and creativity at the intersection of art, science, and technology. The purpose of Hub Week aligns closely with Radcliffe's own dual mission of fostering advanced work that transcends disciplines and sharing that work with the public, with you. In addition to serving as Dean of this institute, I wear a second hat as a professor of history and American studies at Harvard. And today I'm delighted to tip both my dean's hat and my professorial hat to Professor Carol Oja, my colleague in American studies and a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute this year. And Carol will deliver this afternoon's lecture, as you know. I realize that today may be the first introduction to the Radcliffe Institute for many of you, so I'd like to just take a moment to explain a bit more about who we are and what we do. As Harvard's Institute for Advanced Study, Radcliffe is one of the 13 schools that make up Harvard University. As I mentioned a moment ago, we carry out a dual mission. First, we cultivate a uniquely interdisciplinary intellectual community in which faculty and students from Harvard and leading thinkers from around the world all engage in scholarship, scientific investigation, and the creative arts across many academic fields. And second, we are dedicated to sharing cutting-edge work with the public by hosting free events like today's lecture, and then posting videos of our lectures and conferences on our Radcliffe website. We pursue our dual mission through three core programs. The first of our core programs is our Radcliffe Fellowship Program. Every year, we bring 50 scholars, scientists, and artists to campus as fellows to work at the forefront of their fields and across disciplinary boundaries. Today's speaker, Carol Oja, is this year's Frida L. Miller Fellow, and I am very pleased to have Frida Miller's son, Myron Miller, here with us today. The Frida Miller Fellowship was established in Frida's name by Myron's late father, Herman Miller, to honor Frida's passionate belief in higher education. And I have to say that I have a special affection for the Miller Fellowship, Miller family, and the fellowship, because the Frida L. Miller gift was, in fact, the gift that funded my Radcliffe Fellowship when I was a Radcliffe Fellow, 2001-2. In addition to Carol, this year's fellows include leading thinkers from 6 different continents. They are studying everything from the origins of the universe to marvels in late medieval literature to human rights in Latin America. And this year's artists are creating everything from sculptures to poems to operas. Our second major program is the Schlesinger Library, which is the foremost library dedicated to the history of women and gender in the United States. Recently, the library has made a substantial commitment to telling the fullest, most inclusive story of the American past by taking steps to diversify our holdings to include collections from women and organizations across every racial, class, geographical, and political divide. To that end, the Schlesinger Library will be holding a panel discussion called Writing the Record on Monday, October 17th at 4:15. This program will consider the challenges and the rewards of collecting the papers of political conservatives and their organizations. It will be moderated by Ross Douthat, who's a columnist at the New York Times. Our third program we call Academic Ventures, and it hosts an array of conferences, lectures, exhibitions, and performances that are all open to the public. For example, on Thursday, October 13th at 4:15, we'll be sponsoring a panel discussion called Families in Flight, which will explore today's international refugee crisis. And I think you have a card for that, the yellow card on your seat. Our annual full-day science symposium will take place on Friday, October 28th, beginning at 9 a.m. This year's symposium is entitled From Sea to Changing Sea, and it will investigate the world's endangered oceans. And I'm just going to mention one more event. You have the calendar cards that will tell you about more, but I think this may interest the audience we have here today. Garth Risk Hallberg, who's the author of a widely acclaimed novel called City on Fire, set in New York City in the 1970s, and he will be talking about his book and about the challenges of writing fiction about a specific time and place. That will take place on Tuesday, November 15th. All of these events will take place here at the Knaufel Center, along with many others, as I said, that are listed on that card. You can also visit our website and learn about our calendar, and there you can register for lectures and conferences and watch videos of previous events. So I hope we will see you often in the year ahead. All these events are free and open to the public, but in many cases we ask you to register ahead so we can be sure to accommodate the audience. The Radcliffe Institute is a busy place, but no matter how busy, the heart of any institute for advanced study is its fellowship program. And I'm very pleased to offer you this glimpse into ours through the work of our fellow Carol Oja. Carol is a scholar of musicology, history, and literature. She is also a star teacher, which I happen to know because I have seen her in action. One semester, and this was actually quite a number of years ago already, I was teaching a graduate class on the city in 20th century American culture, and Carol was teaching another graduate seminar in the music department, and we brought our classes together for a session on Shuffle Along, a 1920s musical featuring an all African-American cast. During that joint class, I was extremely impressed by Carol's talent for operating on two scales. She drew students deep into discussion about how each chord and each lyric was the product of the composer's deliberate decisions. But she also never lost sight of the larger historical context in which those choices were made. Her probing questions revealed critical insights into the racial politics of New York in the 1920s. Much like her teaching, Carol's repertoire of written scholarship operates on two registers and in multiple keys. In her book, Making Music Modern, she examines the artistic and historic forces at work in New York's creative explosion of the 1920s. Like a pianist's fingers working to produce rich harmonic tones, her prose moves nimbly from probing the composition of melody on the one hand to assessing the impact of international politics on cultural production on the other. In her book, Bernstein Meets Broadway, Carol follows the Boston-born Leonard Bernstein from his boyhood here in the Hub through the social and cultural politics of the US at war. She remains attentive to each sharp and flat in Bernstein's score to his hit musical On the Town, and at the same time, she never forgets the tragedy of a Japanese-American Broadway star enchanting audiences while her father languished in an internment camp. Nor does she overlook the bitter irony of African-American performers finally making their way into integrated orchestras and chorus lines, even as African-American GIs in World War II remain barred from many fighting military units and from many public accommodations throughout the United States. Now today, Carol will be sharing with us some new work. She will take a close look at the role of concert singer Marian Anderson in the long fight against segregation in the United States. This talk is part of Carol's fellowship project, an inquiry into the racial politics of classical music performance in post-war America. That project is a striking illustration of exactly the sort of interdisciplinary study that we at Radcliffe strive to make possible. Carol's work, like that of many of our fellows, crosses those traditional disciplinary boundaries to help us see and understand the world in new ways. So now I ask you to please join me in welcoming Carol Oja.
Thanks, Liz. It was a very generous introduction, and I'm really grateful to be here at Radcliffe this year. It seems like just a small and short step across Mass Ave from the music department, but in fact, it's a pretty big distance in terms of just how my time is spent and in terms of meeting a new group of people with the other fellows at Radcliffe. Memory shifts over time, as does the collective perception of who constitutes a major historical figure and what events are viewed as cultural landmarks. Not so long ago, a concert given by the great African-American contralto Marian Anderson on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939 was hailed widely as a catalyzing event in the civil rights movement. It was routine to narratives of the struggle, and it served as a visual and strategic prelude to the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. Anderson's extraordinary outdoor performance was the first massive staging of passive resistance on behalf of civil rights at the Lincoln Memorial, and the concert attracted a racially integrated crowd of some 75,000 people. A new design for the $5 bill, which was announced last spring, honors that history. It will retain Lincoln on the front, but be reworked on the back to feature historic events at the memorial. Marian Anderson will be part of that scheme, together with Martin Luther King and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Even though Anderson will be one of the first women to appear on US paper money in a very long time, and even though she is among the first African Americans ever to be represented there, she is far less known today than once was the case. When the new $5 bill was announced by Secretary of the Treasury Jacob Lew, Newsweek ran a story titled, "Who is Marian Anderson?" giving a vivid sense of how memories are fading. In Secretary Lew's press release, he described Anderson as a world-renowned opera singer. And today, I want to query that characterization. World-renowned is apt, but opera is deeply problematic, given the fact that Anderson, like all gifted Black performers of her day, faced structural segregation in the country's opera houses, indeed in most of its institutions of elite musical culture. This afternoon, I will start by exploring a few highly publicized moments in Anderson's career, viewing them in relation to segregationist practices in the concert venues where she performed. My ultimate focus will be to shape a contextual history of Anderson's debut at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, which took place on January 7th, 1955. It was the first time that a singer of color was featured by that internationally recognized company since its founding in 1880. With Marian Anderson, there's a solid literature, much of it indebted to a rich biography of Alan Kyler from Brandeis. Wallace Cheatham has also been an important figure in chronicling the history of Black opera singers. My goal is to shift the angle of inquiry to focus on racial practices in the American infrastructure of classical music and the impact of those practices on gifted performers like Anderson. So first, let's get acquainted, or for some of you, I'm sure, reacquainted with Marian Anderson. One of the most widely acclaimed performers of the mid-20th century, Anderson attained a degree of celebrity that's hard to grasp today, since classical music no longer occupies the same broad-based popularity in American culture. Born in 1897, she launched her career in the early 1920s and retired in 1965. Just going to pause over that because that is a very long career. She first came to attention in the white concert world in 1925 when she won a vocal competition sponsored by the National Music League and the New York Philharmonic's Stadium Concerts, a summertime outdoor series in Lewiston Stadium at City College in Harlem. By doing so, Anderson defied every racial exclusion in place at the time, winning the competition through the force of her talent. As a result, she made a debut with the Philharmonic at the stadium that same summer, and the stadium concerts became a site for desegregation overall. Open-air venues seemed more amenable to change than the close confines of an indoor hall. The depth of Anderson's talent was proclaimed time and again, most famously by the Italian conductor Arturo Toscanini, who, after hearing her perform in Salzburg in 1935, declared that she had a voice so exceptional as to appear only once in 100 years. Toscanini was quoted frequently in the ensuing decades as superlatives flowed from the critical establishment. Anderson sang for kings and queens and American presidents. She filled concert halls and open-air stadiums, often jam-packed to the limits of fire regulations. She toured the country and the world, giving an astounding number of concerts each year. And she recorded prodigiously and was a regular fixture on the radio with television appearances as well. In short, Anderson became a superstar, with autograph seekers lining up after her concerts. In 1941, there were reportedly 27 Marian Anderson fan clubs across the United States. Yet she achieved this popular acclaim within the largely white classical music business. Performers who made their living by interpreting music from the revered European tradition were almost exclusively of European descent. Segregation also held firm in the country's leading music conservatories, which only gradually started to admit black students, and in fact, Marian Anderson never studied at any of the major conservatories. It wasn't possible. Hiring practices and systems of critical evaluation were racially determined, with white performers assumed as the norm. This was not only the case in the South, but also in the urban North, notably in New York City, the epicenter of American classical music. In a minute, we will hear Marian Anderson in 1951 performing Der Erlkönig, a renowned 19th century art song by Franz Schubert, which became one of her greatest hits. Franz Rupp is at the piano. He became Anderson's accompanist in 1941, and the two worked together until the end of her career. Set to a poem by Goethe, Erlkönig tells the story of a father who carries his son on horseback in a terrifying ride. The son senses an evil spirit, and the father repeatedly reassures him that it's a natural phenomenon, such as the wind, or in the excerpt you're about to hear, the ancient willows. The conclusion is devastating, with the child suddenly dead in his father's arms. The performer of Erlkönig needs to have the dramatic capacity to depict four characters: a narrator, the father, the son, and the Erl King. Shifting ranges are key to conveying the different personalities, and the song has mostly been identified with male performers. For Anderson, as a contralto, meaning a low alto, Erlkönig offered an opportunity to showcase the tremendous range of her voice, including its beautiful lower registers. It also displayed the deep empathy of her interpretive talent. This excerpt includes the shattering conclusion.
Ich liebe dich, mich reizt deine schöne Gestalt, und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt. Mein Vater, etwas der mich an, der König hat mir ein Leid getan. Dem Vater Trausetz, reitet geschwind, hält in Armen das exilne Kind. Erreicht den Hof mit Mühe und Not. In seinen Armen das Kind war tot.
Thus, Anderson was known to music lovers around the world as a recitalist. Before tackling the vexed term of opera, let's explore her most famous historical moment, which in many ways defined her career and her public image. This, of course, was the concert at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday in 1939. Through an intense get-out-the-crowd initiative by the NAACP, Anderson performed to an enormous mixed-race audience, a sea of diversity that stretched out from the memorial. A headline in the New York Herald Tribune described her concert as the biggest assemblage since the welcome of Lindbergh in 1927. Just a few months before the event, Anderson's manager, Saul Hierroch, perhaps the most powerful such figure in the performance business at the time, had attempted to book a concert for her at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., which was then the district's central performance facility, home to the National Symphony Orchestra and the Washington Opera. This was 3 decades before the opening of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Constitution Hall was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and its management turned down Herock's request, claiming that the facility was already booked. In fact, DIR was enforcing the whites-only clause in its contract. By that point in her career, Anderson had performed in the great concert facilities of Europe and the US. Her exclusion on the basis of race was taken up by Walter White of the NAACP, who worked in close collaboration with Herock, using Anderson's case to contest the widespread segregation of concert venues and other public spaces. An intense lobbying campaign ensued, and a Marian Anderson committee was formed, with Charles H. Houston, a prominent NAACP litigator, as its attorney. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt famously resigned from the DAR in protest, and Harold Ickes, then Secretary of the Interior, took up the cause, which led to locating the event at the Lincoln Memorial. As Ickes put it in introducing Anderson at the concert, the memorial was a great auditorium under the sky in which all of us are free. The Chicago Defender, one of the country's leading black newspapers, declared, "Intolerance received one of the heaviest blows of the ages on Easter Sunday. A huge crowd, estimated at 75,000 persons, as varicolored as the Easter season itself, paid homage to a great singer in a scene which, in its symbolism and poignancy, surpassed any words that might be used to describe it. All seemed to mingle with one common interest, the determination to welcome the greatest singer of this generation and to show that tolerance lives." Anderson's concert was broadcast nationally, thus heard by millions, and it was also filmed. Here's a clip of her elegantly claiming the status of a diva in a mink coat, singing America the Beautiful. She approaches it like an art song with crisp diction, and it's clear she owns the song's message. Her accompanist is the Finnish pianist and composer Kosti Vähänen, whom Anderson worked with until 1940, when World War II drew him home. The film provides very quick glimpses of the mixed-race audience, and you'll notice that Anderson is singing at the high end of her 3-octave range.
Genius draws no color line. And so it is fitting that Marian Anderson should raise her voice in tribute to the noble Lincoln whom mankind will ever honor. Miss Marian Anderson.
In the mid-1950s, the New York music critic Hugh Thompson interviewed Anderson and asked if the Daughters of the American Revolution had ever apologized to her. "She paused," he recounted, "and a momentary look in her eyes told me she still felt the sting of that insult. Not that I was ever aware of," she said. Despite her symbolic power on behalf of civil rights, Anderson never became an outspoken racial protester. But that doesn't mean she lacked agency in taking courageous steps. Rather, her resistance was performed on stage with a consistent assertion of high-level professionalism as her weapon. Over and over, she made the choice to sing in racially fraught settings where she majestically delivered her art. Viewed as a whole, Anderson's career provides a granular view of the astounding battle, the mind-numbing details that were involved in maintaining segregation and then dismantling it. Ticketing and seating for concerts moved from whites-only audiences to what was termed horizontal segregation, with people of color in the back of the hall and the balcony. Then came vertical segregation, with a literal line drawn down the center of auditoriums to separate the races. Hard as it is to grasp today, the vertical arrangement was once viewed as a sign of progress. In a letter to the New York Times in 1939, a man identifying himself as a tobacco employee who traveled regularly through the South noted that when the Metropolitan Opera visited Houston, people of color were prohibited from attending. He described a concert there by Anderson with vertical segregation. The concert at Houston was given in the Civic Auditorium before an audience of 5,000, approximately 1/3 of them Negroes. The house was cut vertically from top to bottom, with Negroes on all floors, but occupying the third to one side of the stage. When Miss Anderson made her first appearance, she bowed perfunctorily straight in front of her, then turned deliberately toward those of her own race and bowed very low and long. It was the most beautiful and most queenly gesture I have ever seen. And of course, the word Negro was used commonly during this period. You're going to hear it a lot in quotations today, and didn't have the same stigma as it now does. Anderson was a hard worker, giving some 60 concerts a year at her peak with repeated tours through the South. In 1950, she spoke of how it was right for her to go to the South, even though it meant that she traveled with her own pots and pans to avoid segregated restaurants, and even though she often stayed in private homes. On almost every trip, Anderson stated, I give concerts in places I've never been before, and a number of my people get a great deal more out of actually seeing a person than they do by hearing about the artist or hearing a performance on the radio. Seeing a person, some of them can be inspired. As was the case with most black artists performing in the South, Anderson risked facing violence. After 1951 or so, her performance contracts included a clause prohibiting segregation in audience seating. Enforcing that clause brought difficulties, and her manager, Saul Hierok, stood firm. As one example, Anderson gave back-to-back concerts in Jacksonville and Miami in January of 1952, and because of her contract clause, audiences were reportedly integrated for the first time in the state, albeit contentiously so. The events put Anderson on the cover of Jet magazine. Although both programs went off without incident, Miss Anderson received the largest police protection ever given an artist in Miami. 50 plainclothes officers, including FBI agents, circulated constantly through the audience. The article goes on to note that the KKK held what was termed a routine meeting outside of Jacksonville during Anderson's performance there. Studying Marian Anderson in relation to institutional segregation means probing a complex network of racial and performance challenges. Obviously, the question of geography was central, with the South yielding the most problems. But the urban North also had its Jim Crow practices, and so here are some of the issues involved. For one thing, Anderson faced strong opinions from both blacks and whites about the race of her accompanist and how she would interact with that person on stage. She had 3 main accompanists over the course of her career, and all were male. The first was William King, known as Billy, who was from Anderson's hometown of Philadelphia. King accompanied Anderson for her debut at the New York Stadium concerts, and they worked together until she began making extended trips to Europe in the late 1920s and the 1930s. Before then, a large percentage of Anderson's engagements came from black venues and community organizations. While in Europe, Anderson began collaborating with Kosti Vähänen, and when Saul Hierok took over her management in 1935, he persuaded her to continue working with Kosti when she returned to the United States. This meant ending her partnership with William King, which was fraught to do. It also raised concerns about performing with a white pianist in US concerts sponsored, quote, under Negro auspices, as Anderson wrote to Claude Barnett of the Associated Negro Press in 1935. The ANP was a black news syndicate. Later, when Anderson began working with the German emigre Franz Rupp, the two often shook hands or even held hands while taking bows, as is traditional for performers within the European concert tradition. Objections were raised in some American cities about interracial touching, but the two stood firm. And Rupp was the one who usually made a genial but clear statement to the press. Another issue had to do with the racial heritage of the music being performed. In her programming, Anderson consistently followed the model of her Black predecessors, especially Henry T. Burleigh and Roland Hayes, by opening with European repertory, usually a balance of opera arias and art songs, and ending with concert arrangements of what were then called Negro spirituals. This program for an NAACP-sponsored concert in West Virginia in the late 1930s illustrates the standard format. Two of the arrangers listed there were African American, Burleigh and Florence Price. The spirituals constituted a kind of political statement, asserting that this repertory, identified with slavery, deserved an equal status with revered works from the Austro-German tradition. Yet Anderson's renditions of spirituals faced racialized expectations, with reviewers in the white press often seeming preoccupied by the spirituals while paying less attention to the other repertory she performed. The racial assumptions could be crude. For example, after a recital at New York City's Town Hall in 1935, an event billed as her homecoming after 4 years of working abroad, a critic for the New York Herald Tribune called Spirituals the most thrilling work on her recital. He continued, "These the singer wisely did not attempt to sing in the manner of an art song, but rather a musical reflection of indigenous attributes." Like, what does that mean? In 1943, the composer and critic Virgil Thomson, known for his arch pronouncements that often carried a sting, wrote that when Anderson gets down to singing in her own language, the religious music of her own people, that is where she leaves off being a lovely icicle and becomes a flame. In the face of such comments, Anderson could have avoided spirituals. Instead, she doubled down, continuing over the decades to assert the repertory as a central part of her artistic identity. To sample this aspect of Anderson's legacy, here she is performing He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, which is among her core works. The arrangement is by Hamilton Forrest, Franz Rupp is at the piano, and the performance was recorded around 1950. Anderson performed this same spiritual at the March on Washington in 1963. It's not great film quality, but you get the idea.
He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the big round world in his hands. He's got the wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the sun and the moonlight in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the light.
Franz Rupp was a fine accompanist, as I'm sure you can hear. Yet another racial issue had to do with Heroic Attractions, Anderson's management from 1935 on, which had to adapt from the habits of only representing white artists. They'd only had one artist of color before her, and it was not someone with the same sort of impact and breadth of career. This affected many details of putting on concerts, including the need for a mixed-race network for promotion and newspaper criticism. For example, there was the question of who should be offered press passes. Claude Barnett of the Associated Negro Press took up the battle, writing to Heroic's office in January 1936, so this is at the very beginning of the time when Anderson worked with Heroic, that at Anderson's recent concert, the ANP's New York representative, quote, was not accorded the courtesies which one of his standing and capability had a right to expect. To its credit, the Heroic agency regrouped immediately, asking for the names of ANP correspondents who were assigned to New York concerts, and they followed through. Finally, Anderson and Heroic had to cope with the racial policies and practices of the country's most illustrious concert facilities. Earlier, I mentioned a pair of incidents in Florida, but segregation wasn't always so clear-cut in New York City. Town Hall had a strong history of featuring performers of color. Other facilities were also open, albeit often with limitations. Here was a fundamental issue for Anderson. There was a basic difference between renting a facility rather than being hired by its most prominent and eponymous performance organization. Which leads us to Marian Anderson's debut with the Metropolitan Opera in January 1955. It was the second most famous event in her career, and it was just as momentous for the Met, ending a 75-year history of racial exclusion. In histories of the Metropolitan Opera, there's a gaping silence about the company's racial practices. Anderson's debut is routinely noted as a positive development, but the long period in which the company practiced a whites-only policy is ignored. The silence was established in part by the white press. Black newspapers, by contrast, decried the company repeatedly over the decades. In 1944, for example, Baltimore's Afro-American excoriated the Met for what it called an Aryans-only policy. And for those of you who are historians and archival researchers, you know that it's only within the last 10 to 15 years that black newspapers have been digitized, which has transformed everything in terms of doing the kind of research I'm now involved in. Civil rights historians talk about studying a nation within a nation when they study black culture. And musically, that's as true as it is in any other dimension. So for me, the black newspapers are really crucial to flip a perspective on classical music performance by artists of color. With the Met, racial change came about through a protracted effort on the part of civil rights organizations, black newspapers, and progressive whites in positions of power. In Anderson's case, the latter included Saul Hurok and Howard Taubman of the New York Times, who grew increasingly outspoken as the years passed. As a result, Anderson's debut at the Met didn't appear as a magical change in attitude on the part of the company, but rather was the result of a multi-year lobbying campaign, a breakthrough that occurred when she was 58 years old, past the prime of any singer. Beginning in April 1943, just a few years after Anderson's triumph at the Lincoln Memorial, she began asserting her presence on the Met stage. To challenge the opera company's racial exclusions, Saul Hurok instead made the symbolic gesture of renting the hall, with Anderson physically occupying it and filling the house with her glorious voice in spite of the company's prejudices. She consistently packed the place, which could hold an audience of nearly 4,000. And this was the old Met on Broadway between 39th and 40th. The Metropolitan Opera House at Lincoln Center didn't open until 1966, and when that happened, this building was torn down. In 1943, the same year as Anderson's first solo concert on the Met stage, Howard Taubman published a book for fans of classical music titled Music on My Beat, an intimate volume of shop talk. In chapter 15, titled The Negro in Music, Taubman let loose, articulating racial realities that were not otherwise being widely acknowledged among white readers and audiences. How can we expect a hospitable approach to the Negro musician from the Metropolitan Opera House when some of its patrons will not even tolerate the presence of a Negro in an adjacent seat? At a recent opening at the Metropolitan, several Negroes, dressed in white tie and tails like the other customers, occupied $10 seats. Some subscribers whose seats adjoined those held by the Negroes were annoyed. They complained to the box office, which explained that the seats were purchased through speculators. For the box office has to be tender about the prejudices of its quality trade. If Negro customers buy tickets directly from the box office, precautions are taken to give them aisle seats and to tear up the ticket for the adjoining seat so that no white patron will have to rub shoulders with a Negro. Even when business is good, this practice is followed. An opera official explained with a long face that the sacrifice had to be made. Taubman continued, but with unchanging bigotries and the paying customers, how can we expect essentially conservative institutions like the Metropolitan Opera or the New York Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra to invite Negroes to become members of singing or playing personnel? Taubman later was the ghostwriter for Anderson's autobiography, My Lord, What a Morning, which appeared in 1956. Anderson's campaign at the Met continued, and she was back on its stage in 1945 and 46, again with concerts on Sunday afternoons in April. Then, in 1947, Hurok landed the booking he must have been aiming for all along. Not only was Anderson's rental of the Met in April, but it took place on Easter, which then became an annual event. It was a brilliant stroke. Anderson's triumph at the Lincoln Memorial had, of course, occurred on Easter Sunday, and her standing room concerts at the Met identified her even more intensely with the symbolism of that day, with hope and renewal, with the possibility of triumphing over tragedy, with Christian goodness. Most of those attending the concert were members of her own race. New York's Amsterdam News, a black newspaper, observed after Anderson's Easter concert in 1947. Mr. Herock's office informed me, the reporter continued, that advertisement had purposely been released in the Negro papers first, so no one could say there was partiality of any kind. Anderson also presented Easter concerts at the Met in 1948 and 49. Then, in May 1950, she sailed on the Queen Elizabeth for a concert tour of Europe and South America, and Rudolph Bing, the recently appointed general director of the Metropolitan Opera Company, was on board as well. That same year, Anderson made another strategic move, releasing her first recording of opera duets together with Jan Pierce, a tenor at the Met. Rudolph Bing's appointment made a difference, as did the leadership of Max Rudolph, the Met's conductor at the time. Both were European. Bing was Viennese-born and a British national, while Rudolph had emigrated from Germany. In 1951, the Met's color line started to waver, even as an incremental campaign intensified to remake the company into a desegregated artistic and social space. On January 21st, Duke Ellington and his orchestra presented a benefit concert for the NAACP at the Met with a strategically chosen group of prominent supporters. Once again, gifted performers of color occupied the hall. Mrs. Vincent Impellitteri, wife of the mayor of New York City, served as hostess, and Marian Anderson was one of the chairwomen. In March, Fred Thomas, a young black baritone from Norristown, Pennsylvania, was among 3 winners of the Metropolitan Opera's Auditions of the Air, a contest with 700 entrants. And around the same time, a reporter from the American Negro Press sent questions to the Met's popular opera quiz, asking when the company would hire a black artist. In October, a significant breakthrough occurred when the Met signed the African-American ballerina, Janet Collins, as one of its 2 premier dancers. The Pittsburgh Courier, a black newspaper, declared that a long and bitter fight has been carried on for over 10 years for such an opportunity in the world's most famous opera house. In November, the New York Post reported, for the first time in the history of the Metropolitan Opera House's dressy openings, Negroes were admitted last night to the swanky Sherry's Bar, where society and cafe society relax at intermissions. Marian Anderson, the famous singer, was one of the Negroes served, but not the first. That same month, 4 black singers appeared in the chorus of Cavalleria Rusticana, thus managing to, quote, break the Aida pattern, as another black paper, the Atlanta Daily World, put it. To date, Aida has been the only operatic vehicle in which most Negro singers were featured, the article continued. In 1953, Robert McFerrin became the first African American to win the Metropolitan Opera of the Air auditions. Then in 1954, Sylvia Olden Lee became the first African American on the Met staff. A brilliant pianist and vocal coach, Lee became the coach to multiple generations of Met singers, including Shirley Verrett, Kathleen Battle, and Jesse Norman. The biggest breakthrough of all occurred that October when Bing signed Anderson to appear with the Met the following January. Anderson noted in an interview that the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education had taken place that May, and, quote, it gives the feeling that they are beginning to understand, to know that you're there. Anderson's actual debut on January 7th, 1955, was a major cultural event with heavy attendance by African Americans, including many who had traveled from all over the country. Hired Cadillacs deposited parties from Harlem, declared the Associated Negro Press, and it was sheer delight to see parties of lovely teenage girls chaperoned by their elders taking their seats. Plus, 2 porters at the Met purchased tickets and proudly entered as guests. Prominent figures turned out, including Langston Hughes and an impressive array of black vocalists, Roland Hayes, Eva Jesse, who conducted the chorus of the original Porgy and Bess, Madewilda Dobbs, who was the first black singer to debut at La Scala, Leontine Price, and Camilla Williams and Lawrence Winters, who were then featured artists with the New York City Opera. Founded in 1943, the New York City Opera had broken the color line in 1946. Here is an excerpt of Marian Anderson in the recording of Masked Ball made immediately after her premiere. While it is tempting to end this tale on a triumphal note, which has frequently been the case in historical narratives, the sobering reality is that Anderson was asked to play a character rife with long-standing racial stereotypes and ties to the tradition of blackface minstrelsy. Her role was that of Ulrika in Verdi's Masked Ball, an opera seldom performed at the time. When the opera was composed in the mid-19th century, the original location of the plot was changed from Sweden to colonial Boston. In a recent article, one scholar of Italian history has called the revised opera, quote, a remarkably painful theatrical representation of life in the New World. There, Ulrika is described in the libretto as possessing, quote, the foul blood of the Negroes. In the 19th century, Ulrika was played by a white singer in blackface, even as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin generated considerable discussion in Italy. Ulrika sings in only one scene, which takes place in Act 1. When Marian Anderson took the stage, she was attired in a long black wig, waved a skull and crossbones, and stirred an immense cauldron. She was a fearful character, one observer noted. Another commented on the contrast to the evening gowns she wears in recitals. Only a few cultural critics at the time connected the dots between the exotic othering of Ulrika and that of Marian Anderson. The notion of colorblind casting, as we conceive it today, barely existed, and the practices of blackface were alive and well on stage and screen. Among those alert to racial representation was Dean Gordon Hancock of the American Negro Press, who wrote an article immediately after Anderson's premiere, highlighting the implications of what had transpired. It is interesting to note here that this opera originally called for a Negro as Ulrika, and in addition gives some conception of the light in which Negro race was held in Italy prior to 1859. For the judge, in addressing Ricardo, says, Ulrika, she is of the vile race of Negroes. Hancock continued, of course, she says it in Italian, which in New York City maybe people didn't notice as much. Curiously, Anderson was playing two roles, a member of the vile race of Negroes and an arch pioneer in finally bringing democracy to an operatic institution of which all Americans should be unanimously proud. Anderson performed Ulrika 6 times on the stage of the old Metropolitan Opera House, and 2 of those performances were featured in the company's radio broadcasts. For Anderson, there was no opportunity for a career in opera. Rather, she used her celebrity to crack open a door that had previously been unmovable. A string of Met debuts followed by African-American singers, including Robert McFerrin in Aida on January 27, 1955, 3 weeks after Anderson's breakthrough, Madewilda Dobbs in Rigoletto in 1956, and Gloria Davy in Aida in 1958. The Met debut of Leontine Price in 1961 in Trovatore marked the biggest advance of all. Price became a central member of the company rather than an artist featured only a few times. My research this year at Radcliffe is dedicated to exploring threads of this sort in the history of racial desegregation in American performance. And I want to conclude today by looping back to the press release about the new $5 bill, which used the term opera singer, and also to Newsweek's recent question, who is Marian Anderson? With the press release, the Secretary of the Treasury must have deployed opera for its cultural cachet, intending it as a compliment to Anderson, as a validation. Yet given the pernicious exclusion of her from opera stages, it's poignant, if not painful, to associate her with a status that she was in fact prevented from achieving. Meanwhile, Newsweek's headline exposes the enormous gaps in historical memory about on-the-ground realities of racial segregation, and about the spectrum of figures who played a role in the civil rights movement. To move forward as a multiracial citizenry, we need to do better. Thank you.